Okay, so there we have it. An admission of guilt, a confession, a smoking gun, whatever you want to call it, straight from the horse's mouth and other assorted cliches. What we warned about has been proven comprehensively to be correct. Not a conspiracy theory. So today, a hard-right conference took place called the National Conservatism Conference, which I'll talk more about. And Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is the slightly absurd torchbearer of hard-right Tory politics, declared parties that try and gerrymander end up finding their clever schemes come back to bite them, as I dare say we found out by insisting on voter ID for elections. We found the people who didn't have ID were elderly, and they, by and large, voted Conservative, so we made it hard for our own voters and we upset a system that worked perfectly well. So what Jacob Rees-Mogg is admitting is that the point of voter ID was to gerrymander the voting system in favour of the Conservatives. People like me and many others have been saying this ever since the Conservatives first floated the plan, that this was searching for a problem that barely exists. The cases of voter fraud, the evidence for voter fraud in this country is almost non-existent. I mean, it's literally almost non-existent. Year after year, every study has shown that this problem is barely there. And yet, instead, we end up with significant numbers of voters either prevented from voting or deterred from voting. We know that, as the evidence shows, that Labour voters are the least likely to have a valid voter ID. What the Conservatives did, given there was a generational divide and younger voters are less likely to have valid ID, pensioners, and I know I need to always say this because I have pensioners who watch this show, this channel, or listen to the podcast, who go, hold on a minute, I'm a lifelong socialist, how dare you? I've been a socialist longer than you've been alive. I get that, but just statistically speaking, older voters are overwhelmingly likely to support Conservatives, certainly in the last two elections, compared to younger voters who overwhelmingly supported Labour. And it's absolutely the case that elderly voters, whatever Jacob Rees-Mogg says, were given lots of voter ID options that were not available to younger voters who are more predisposed to vote for the Labour Party. All he's saying then is he regrets this policy because it was intended, as he suggested, to gerrymander the election in favour of Conservatives, but he alleges that actually it ended up punishing pensioners who were more likely to vote Conservatives instead. Now, he didn't say this when he was a minister, when he was supporting voter ID, compulsory voter ID being forced through Parliament. He then defended it from these accusations. So we now know that when we were called conspiracy theorists and all the rest of it by the Conservatives for making this point, we were absolutely correct, and the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg were clearly not saying the accurate truth about what voter ID meant. Now, we already had evidence that the Conservatives knew all this. The Spectator... in the Spectator, there was a piece which said there was also the potential impacts of voter ID changes to consider when they were talking about the Tories' election prospects, adding Tower Hamlets will be voting Tory for the first time, jokes one Conservative. Now, the joke there, if you want to call it a joke, is that Tower Hamlets overwhelmingly doesn't vote for the Conservatives at all. And in fact, its voters are overwhelmingly likely to vote for left of centre parties. Actually, a party called Aspire actually thrashed Labour from the left in local elections last year. But nonetheless, Tower Hamlets is clearly somewhere which does not support the Conservatives, except for little rich enclaves, because Tower Hamlets includes Canary Wharf and so on. But nonetheless, what they were saying there is voter ID will prevent so many natural Labour voters from being able to vote that even in Tower Hamlets will end up with the Conservatives winning. Now, this whole approach was imported from the United States, from the Republican right, who have really pioneered attempts to rig the electoral system in favour of the natural voter base of the Republicans. So what they've tried to do is deter particularly black Americans from voting by a whole range of devious means, and other voters who are most likely to support the Democrats, and to, stitch up election boundaries to that end. And voter ID has been part of that particular mix. Now, I have to say, the absolute chutzpah, the cheek of the right of this country, who are claiming that, and I'm going to defend Labour now. See, I can do it. Caveats will apply. The Daily Mail's front page, Starmer to use EU citizens to rig polls. Now, This is based on suggestions that Labour could extend the franchise so that long-standing EU citizens who can vote in local elections can also vote in general elections. Let's just hear what Keir Starmer had to say.
If someone has been here, say, 10, 20, 30 years, contributing to this economy, part of our community, they ought to be able to vote. Let me bring it alive. I've obviously knocked on a lot of doors in the last few years, and you go to doors sometimes in general election and you're met with someone who says, look, I'm an EU citizen. I've been living here for 30 years. I'm married to a Brit. My kids were raised and brought up here. They're now working in the UK. I'm even working in lots of community projects, etc. But I can't vote. And I think that feels wrong, and something ought to be done about. When someone has, let's just take someone who's been here for 30 years, has literally put down their roots here, as I say, married to a Brit, their kids are here. This is their country, this is where they live, this is where they contribute. I think it's very hard to say, well, you should really be voting back in your country of origin where you haven't been living for 30 years. That actually just doesn't pass the common sense test for me.
Now, you know what, the caveat, I'm afraid, has to apply that I don't believe anything Keir Starmer says because he's a serially dishonest politician. He made a series of pledges in the leadership election, which he did not honour and has U-turned on. And on the show, the LBC show, he, goes on down that path, talking about why he's demanding tuition fees, pledges and all the rest of it. But on this particular one, obviously, I support what Keir Starmer is saying. It's absolutely correct that long-standing EU citizens should be able to vote. These are people who live in this country, work in this country. They're our fellow citizens. They're our neighbours. They're our lovers in some cases. Now, it's notable that, let's just explain the difference between what the Tories are accusing Labour of and vice versa. Because what the Tories are doing is accusing they're accusing Labour of seeking to rig elections in Labour's favour by enfranchising long-standing EU citizens who are resident here, as well as extending the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds. Now, the difference in what Labour and the Tories are doing is the Tories know that they benefit when the right to vote is restricted, that democracy is shrunk. They're protesting that the more people who are given the right to vote, the better for Labour. But that's merely conceding that more democracy is bad for the Conservative Party. That's what it's saying. But that's true, obviously. Yeah, the more you expand the right to vote in Britain, the worse it is for the Conservatives. Now, younger people are not innately anti-Tory traditionally. That's a myth. People think, well, you're left-wing when you're young and then the University of Life schools you and all the rest of it. But actually, as a point I've often made, so some of you might be like rolling your eyes at repetition, but in 1983, Margaret Thatcher had a 9-point lead amongst 18 to 24-year-olds. The reason they've become so overwhelmingly anti-Tory is because the Tories built a society which made the lives of younger people pretty hellish. They promised freedom, they delivered insecurity. That's neoliberalism for you. Housing crisis, jobs crisis, attack on the welfare state, attack on youth services, indebting them, saddling them with huge debt for going to university. We could go on, as well as waging war at their social values, on rights for women and minorities. So the Tories wage war at them, and therefore, younger people are not predisposed to voting Tory. So if 16 and 17-year-olds have the right to vote, well, what the Tories would have to do is they would be forced to do more things to address the needs of younger people. If they wanted to make, that's what expanding democracy would do. It would be better for younger people because the Tories, and again, I must emphasise, 1.9 million pensioners live in poverty. Not all pensioners vote Conservative. But it's true that the Conservatives, rightly, ring-fence pensioner provision with a triple lock on pension, which I support. Living standards for pensioners went up, unlike the rest of the population, due to most pensioners are homeowners. House prices went up. The pension triple lock has been protected. That's not true for all pensioners in terms of living standards, but enough to ensure that the Tories won the pensioner vote. Now, they would have to do more to win over younger people, which they clearly are not willing to do. Now, Labour need to commit to expanding the franchise, such as automatic voter registration, proportional representation. Starmer backtracked on that. I often said before that in the Corbyn era that Labour was like a loveless marriage between its left and right flanks, where they were sharing separate beds, separate bedrooms, leaving angry post-its on the fridge. But they couldn't afford a separate house. But now, with the right taking over, the left is basically locked in the attic with the hope that it will just die off. So it was a democratic imperative for me to have proportional representation where you get seats reflected by how many votes you get. getting rid of the outdated first-past-the-post system. Now, that would mean a fair representation of views. They don't want to do that, Starmer's goons, because their view is, well, we crushed the left within the Labour Party. They know they'd have a party to the left which would win seats, and then they would have to do coalitions with them. So, we didn't defeat the left within the Labour Party to have to do coalitions with them for the rest of our lives. And they would know in France, for example, the centre-left became the junior partners in an alliance with the more radical left led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And if people say with proportional representation, well, you'll end up with right-wing extremists too, but that's a moot point because they've taken over the Conservatives, and they'll be more extreme after the election. That's what the National Conservatism Conference is all about. It's a hard-right conference, by the way, which I said to say more about. Speakers who said they want to ban abortion, accused Rishi Sunak of not sharing British values because of his faith. You had a Tory MP talking about cultural Marxism, which is widely regarded as an anti-Semitic dog whistle, who said that low birth rate is UK's top priority, not mentioning the anti-family record of the government, not least how unaffordable childcare is for so many people, or the housing crisis. We could go on. That faction will completely take over the Conservatives after a defeat. So that radical right have already taken over. That's why far-right parties got thrashed at the local elections, because people are like, oh, no, just vote Tory instead. A proportional representation means that there'll be more likely to be a more conventional European-style centre-right, maybe Christian Democratic Party, which has been squashed in the modern Conservatives. So actually it doesn't work. But you should have a fair reflection of views. Labour, at the moment, want to drive out anyone who believes in public ownership, higher taxes on the rich, strong trade unions, scrapping tuition fees. Proportional representation would stop that from happening because all voters would have their views represented. So that's what Labour needs to do. That's why I want a hung parliament, because I don't think Labour will do this if they win a majority. Obviously, I want the Tories out. But what we can see is the Tories have admitted it. They're rigging the electoral system in their favour, and that's why we need a democratic expansion, an expansion of democracy via expanding the right to vote, and also introducing proportional representation, which the smaller party should demand Labour should do in a hung parliament. If that happens, the Labour have every chance, I would say, of winning a majority. That's my thoughts on that. Please like and subscribe. Do support us on patreon.com/OJ84. See you in a bit.